Hi, everyone. This is Matthew Janda for CardRunners, and I'm here with out of position 3-bet pot play part 4, cutoff first button situations. So I have my setup, and none of the ranges have changed since the last video. That doesn't mean they won't eventually change, but I liked the way the cutoff cold calling range was working against a button 3-bet from the last video, so I haven't changed it since then. And I'm going to go ahead and start randomly generating some flops, but unlike in the last video, I'm also going to randomly generate turns and rivers and talk about them as well. Even though we're mainly going to be focusing on the flop because that's when we have to make the toughest decisions because our range is the widest, I do think it's going to be interesting to look at certain turns and river cards, as that will also give us a better idea of, exactly how the button 3-betting range can look pre-flop or what exactly the button should be doing with regards to c-betting on the flop. So we're going to look to see what we would do if we face multiple bets when we're in the cutoff and we face multiple bets from the button. Okay, so let's get started. So this was the first flop I randomly generated, and I've already been playing around with it a little bit. And the cutoff range has 56% equity, whereas the 3-betting range has 44% equity. That shouldn't come to us as a very big surprise for a couple reasons. The first is, with the range we're using, we have many more ace-queen combos in the cutoff cold calling range than we have in the button 3-betting range. And in addition to that, even though this 8 looks like it's not a high card, right? Right at the beginning, I talked about how 2 high cards tend to favor the cutoff 3-bet calling range. But notice that since there's a queen and an 8, we not only make a couple pairs of 8s with the 9-8 suited, but this 10-9 suited, Jack-9 suited, Jack-10 suited, all these hands make gut shots, which give us additional equity in the cutoff flatting range. So the fact that this is an 8 rather than let's make it a 5, that's like 6 or 7% more equity. That's a substantial difference. So that's one of those things that when I talk about this in videos, and as you can tell, I had to pause to analyze this for a minute. Like, I'm not that good where I can right off the bat immediately tell exactly how much equity the 3-bet cold calling range has and what I should do with my entire range. Whereas I'm sure there are some players that are just quite a bit better than me that can just, boom, right off the bat have a much better sense. But if you just understand some like general patterns, hey, there's 2 sort of high-ish cards, the fact that this is an 8 rather than a 5 is going to give the cutoff, cold calling range more equity. That is useful for helping us determine what to do. So here, since our range does have quite a bit of equity, we're going to have to develop a donk betting range. Or at least I think, obviously you can't prove it, but I think a donk betting range is going to make sense here because our range has much more equity than the opponent's, and we also have, ace-queen's just a very good hand. It's not beat very often. It's only beat, let's look, especially if we take into account the removal effects. Ace-queen's beat, only 12% of the time on the flop, which just isn't that bad. Ace-queen will also often have quite a bit of equity even when it's beat. The other thing to note is if we do check to our opponent, the only hands I think the button's really going to want to bet on this flop, like the only super clear bets, I think are going to be his ace-queen suited, his pocket aces, and his pocket kings. That doesn't mean he couldn't bet with hands like jacks or queen-jack off or queen-9 suited, but he couldn't bet multiple streets with them very effectively. So he doesn't have that many hands that make super clear value bets. The reason why I didn't mention pocket queens could probably bet as well, but they have a pretty significant removal effect. So just notice that if we do check on this board texture, our opponent's probably not going to be c-betting all that aggressively if he really thinks, because the queen high board is probably better for our range than his range, and also the 8 adds coordination, which favors us a little bit. Okay, so again, these are with the ranges I'm using. It might be a little different for whatever ranges you decide to use. Okay, so let's start with the value betting range. So we're going to want to make sure we're defending enough of our checks, but I think the sort of obvious value betting hands are usually going to be the 12 combos of ace-queen, and then I think we also can bet some king-queen and we can check some king-queen. So I'm just going to start off with value betting half of the king-queen, and then I'm going to say we're going to check call the other half. We'll tweak it as we get a better sense for how many queens we have in our checking range and how many queens we have in our betting range, but I'm just sort of starting out with putting in hands that seem reasonable. Queen-jack suited I don't think needs to value bet. Come on, buddy. Queen 10 suited. Now, one thing that's kind of neat to do, and I'm actually going to do it right here, is I think it makes sense to value bet with hands like 10s to 9s, because if I bet with 10s and 9s, I can maybe make my opponent fold hands that have 1 or 2 overcards. So let's go look at his range. And let's see, we had the button 3-betting range, 3-betting hands like king-jack off, and then also had some hands with just a single overcard like ace-8 suited and king-9 suited. Again, this might change based on the 3-betting ranges you're using, but the general idea that we can bet sort of 10s or 9s for 1 street of value on this flop seem very reasonable to me. Because if I bet pocket 9s and I make my opponent fold his ace 10 or his king jack or his king 10 or whatever he has, all those hands are reasonable for him to have. it's useful if I make them fold 2 overcards. So I like betting these 10s to 9s, even though they're not very strong value bets. They can probably bet one street for value pretty effectively. And remember, we're betting these 10s or 9s in a range that includes a lot of top pair, top kicker, so our opponent can't just recklessly raise us. So, this range will be balanced.